how would you define trauma?
So a massive umbrella really term, in the fact that it covers so many different areas of people's lives, because you can think about it as a physical trauma, that somebody might actually be physically harmed through trauma, so a physical event on the body, or it can be a very, very stressful event, or a series of stressful events that causes emotional long-lasting damage, really, or emotional responses that go on for some time.
So is there like a link to like how would someone know if they've like experienced that physical or emotional? How would that like show up?
So that's a good question, because that can become part of our personality, part of our character. But early childhood trauma will start to become part of our personality. So it could be that, for instance, one part of trauma can be relational trauma. Relational trauma comes from early relationships and the dynamics between them. So if we talk about that in more accurate, it's attachment trauma, we might call that. Now that's about how we relate to others in our family. So when we're a tiny child, we're absorbing things like we're a sponge. And if the message gets repeated over and over that the safest way to behave is to not create conflict or not ask for what we need, then that becomes to be part of our personality. And so our personality can be formed by trauma or traumatic experiences. But then what do we think about it more as in response to a stressful event or an incident, which can be anything from, as we would traditionally think, like a car accident or coming back from a war zone, as those in the military do, or the other one is like surviving a sexual assault or a physical assault. Then we get a much more intense reaction, which shows up in various symptoms, and then that can be very confusing, because people go through the traumatic event, and then they get left with these symptoms that they don't understand, and that creates more trauma, if you like, because they don't understand it.
And it's a new experience for them because they've not experienced it before. So that's the difference between like when you're a child and it's embedded from that young age, you think that's you, whereas if it's like a later on in life trauma, and it happens and then you think you're okay, but then all these other things start appearing, that's the trauma, and then there's trauma on top of that.
That's right, and that's when it becomes complex trauma.
Okay.
So then there's different. So we call it acute trauma is like that one-off event. The chronic is layers and layers, and so is the complex. I've researched a little bit recently about the chronic, and it really sounds quite like the complex. So the complex is having experienced childhood trauma, and then later on through life experiencing more traumatic events, and that becomes complex. So say somebody not only experienced childhood relational trauma, but then they maybe lost a parent, or a parent went into prison, came to separated from a parent for a long period of time. That's another trauma. And then because of the way it works, and we tend to sort of find ourselves in more of those sort of situations. So for instance, somebody that's been through an abusive household as a child will sadly likely get into abusive relationships. So then that kind of keeps the trauma coming, it keeps that's when the complex layers come.
Okay. So does the trauma have to be like a big thing? So you just said those there for the childhood trauma, like violence and like, does it have to be drastic, or like is there like a trauma that's formed that's might not be seen as trauma?
It's hard to say about because it's likely to be kind of that one's likely to be kind of on a spectrum, I suppose, in how much somebody can experience and how much it affects them, because that'll also be about different people's sensitivity. So different people experience trauma in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we talk about trauma in the Western world, for instance, and it's probably far less than what people in different parts of the world would be experiencing.
Because
that
it's
they
a cultural, maybe cultural norm. So it's very much like an individual basis.
Yes.
So, for example, like if someone was a child and they were that sensitive side that you were just explaining, they would take on more things that like tiny little things that might not matter to someone else, they would then take on, and then that would build up and be
so even somebody's early experiences can affect their mental health in the way of anxiety and depression, and that can be a trauma response over a lifetime of feeling insecure, feeling like maybe that they're not significant or they don't matter.
Yeah. And
then that will come out as a mental health issue when they're older.
Okay. So if somebody was like put in situations that, like for example, as a kid, you know when like kids learn to swim, and the parent or whoever's teaching them puts them in and like slowly, steadily like shows them how to do it, and then like somebody else just picks the child up and chucks them in, that could actually be a trauma for that child.
Yes.
And then that could then like contribute to that anxiety and that fear later on in life.
Yes. Well, that sounds, I would imagine that with a very stressful event, and that would be the outcome.
Yeah.
Whether being thrown in the pool would be a very stressful event, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But it would depend on how that was managed. Okay. So this is the other part of trauma, is how was it managed at the time? Because if somebody slipped in the pool, and there wasn't an act of somebody actually throwing them in the pool, or if it was, and another layer again would be, say that was an angry adult that threw you in the pool, that you knew, that was your parent, and then that adult didn't respond right, that's where you've got the trauma.
Okay.
If you slipped into the pool and there was somebody safe and secure around who rescued you, it would be far less traumatic.
Yeah.
And then if that person helped you out the pool, got you dry, made sure you were secure,
it's like
and if a parent gave you a hug or not,
Yeah. So there's so many layers.
That's where the complexities come.
Okay. So like, for example, somebody got like chucked in the pool, but then it's almost like they got put into things that they felt scared of doing, but then they just got shoved into like it all the time on a regular basis. That would then...
And that's it, because you will find that if somebody is experiencing that from a parent, for instance, that's likely to be happening in different ways. So I bought you a bike, you haven't learned how to ride your bike yet, pressure, anger, stress, and you haven't learned to swim, so I'm going to chuck you in because that's the way that you do it, to make people learn how to swim. Then you'll find that it will come in various ways throughout their childhood. It's a pattern.
Okay.
And that's when it becomes a real problem.
Knock-on effect. So, like, as an adult, how do people understand? Like, how does it come? How does it show? How do people understand that they have these things that are built up, and then it's okay, and what to do, and like, how would that process?
Well, they might recognise their mental health as really suffering. That they are. They might notice. They might have more awareness around when they feel more anxious. So, say somebody struggles with anxiety and depression. And then they bring some awareness to it, because it's all about getting to know yourself, right? Because you can have mental health issues and just kind of live with them and think they're part of you and that they'll always be there. But then people often get to a stage where they go, well, I'd like to do something about this, or maybe I don't need to be experiencing this much anxiety when I, see a dog or something. Yeah. And they decide they want to work on it. Then they can start addressing the symptoms of all of this accumulated trauma, which could be, learning ways to manage anxiety, becoming very aware of their depression, maybe doing some CBT, which is a type of therapy which analyses our thought processes and tries to bring more positive outcomes. There are various ways that people can start to address the issues that have accumulated over the years that are now showing up as mental health issues. But that's where the work is, because somebody has to make that decision that I'd like this to change, and as I say, bring awareness, because the more awareness, then the more information you have. So the more like, I know this happens when this happens. So even if somebody decides to go for counselling, for instance, the more information they've got, the faster the work will be, because I've looked at all of this and I've understood why. When I feel like this, I might not know why. But this is the pattern. So that's for complex stuff. For the more acute incidences that may happen, like something like a sexual trauma, sexual violence, then what people find, what I've noticed is there's a pattern, or there's a way of responding, which is where it's very, very confusing, because there's almost like a personality change. So somebody's been through a very shocking incident, they then feel like they don't know themselves, because they're suddenly more aggressive. So when we think of trauma responses, we think of fight, flight, freeze, fawn. The fight being aggressive, so suddenly they're getting angry over things that they would not normally get stressed about. They might suddenly, like somebody described to me how she became very competitive around chess and was like storm out of a room. So when she didn't win, and this was about everything is more heightened, so the anger's coming out wherever it can. So that's the fight response. Obviously, serious fight would be taking it to another level and actually being very aggressive. But this is what people notice, is they become more snappy, more short-tempered, less tolerant. The flight is anxiety. So they'll find that they start to become very limited, often about what they feel they can do. Anxiety comes into everything, a fear of what might happen if. The freeze is a trauma response that is kind of saved for the most dangerous situations, and sadly people really struggle with the fact they've had that freeze response when the attacks happen, say, because they haven't been able to put those things into place that they may have always prepared for. Somebody who'd been through a serious trauma, she was actually a black belt at karate, she couldn't use that skill because she froze. So it's really distressing for people to live, to not know about that and then have had that experience, i.e. not to have expected that to happen, and it happened, and then the aftermath is, why didn't I? How come I couldn't? How stupid was I? How I failed that experience. Instead of being
not
empowered.
Not only the trauma then affects them, it's the fact that they knew that they could do something about it, but
this
they
is
didn't.
the problem. This is why education around trauma is really important. And that's the first part of the work with people that have been through trauma, is to help them understand their fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses.
So the fawn is?
And the fawn is it's also known as shutdown. And it's when the body just takes sleep. Or shuts off emotions and goes numb.
Just can't function and focus. So,
it's probably, I've known people experience it in the way of they'll have been anxious, so that they maybe had disrupted sleep pattern and struggling with anxiety, and then all of a sudden be able to sleep, and then that can be 14, 16 hours of sleep. Shutdown is another one. How distressing it must be to have one set of symptoms which you think you're kind of maybe getting used to, maybe not understanding or getting to grips with, but getting used to, and then the opposite happens, and there's this what might be described as a slump or a shutdown, and then people really feel like they do not have the energy to, it's like very severe depression. They feel like they can't even open their eyes and do the simplest things, the most basic things. And when they, living with that is really, really difficult, because if somebody lives on their own and they don't have to go to work or fit into any agenda or schedule, they could probably go through these symptoms, and as long as they're not judging themselves too much for it, they might come out the other end recovered, because the body will just keep taking that sleep it needs.
Yeah, it's almost like that healing process.
Yeah,
without having the pressure of having to do everyday stuff.
Yeah, but the minute you've got to do everyday stuff, get children to school on time, manage family members, go to family parties, go to events where you're social, and then feelings can become very overwhelming, some maybe anxious feelings in a public space. And all of this is, there's no understanding for, well, this doesn't make any sense. What I experienced is nothing like this event.
Yeah.
And here I am in this event and experiencing these feelings. And the problem is the brain and body are in this state of dysregulation, and they're preparing for the next trauma. So, and that's what also happens with flashbacks and nightmares. So the nightmares are like where somebody is processing the trauma through the night, and the flashbacks are during the day when something reminds the person of that trauma, and they go straight back there as if it's happening in the here and now.
Okay.
And that's very, very distressing for people.
Yeah, because they're literally reliving it live.
So then they might get a panic attack.
Okay.
So they might go from that flashback straight into a panic attack. And it could be in a public place. It could be on a bus or at the school gates or somewhere where you really wouldn't want that to happen, and have to show your vulnerability in that public place.
So if I just chuck out a few examples and then you tell me if you would consider that as trauma or not.
Okay, yeah.
So if you were in a relationship with somebody that you've been with for years, and then you find something out about them that is not who they are, would that be trauma?
Yeah, I can imagine that would be traumatic. And
Okay.
there's I'd need a little bit more information about that, because there is a type of trauma called betrayal trauma, which might come under that category, which is like, well, I didn't know this person, but maybe what did they do that you didn't know about them? Because if there's any betrayal in that, that can be very affecting over a long period of time.
Okay.
In the way of, especially if you've been with that person for a long time, and then you have to process those years you spent with that person, believing them to be that person, and then this new information makes them a different person in your own mind, and that takes a lot of processing. It can be very distressing.
Okay.
And if you combine that with something like, so for instance, I've understood this about betrayal trauma, where it becomes multi-layered. So, the classic would be, you're in a relationship with somebody and you find out they've been having an affair, and then you find out that they've been having an affair with your best friend.
Yeah.
And that's seriously
layered.
And has betrayal from not only your partner but your best friend.
Yeah.
And you've probably got a lot of loss there, because you've probably lost your partner and your best friend.
Yeah.
So that's a huge amount for people to get over. And one of the classic things that is said about people who don't understand about trauma is they'll say, it's time to get over that now, it's time to move on.
Yeah.
So some people can struggle with this for a year or two at something like that situation, and the actual the recovery can be aided or made much quicker if they get the validation they need, which is like, well, that's not surprising this was so difficult for you. I can imagine that must be very difficult.
Yeah.
Rather than, it's time to be over that now, because it's only the person who's experienced it can direct how soon they are ready to recover from it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it, actually, how something that's said in like so little thought, and how something so simple can have such an impact on someone else. So just because, and this is why it's so important just to have that awareness of all of this stuff, is because if I was to say something to you and I'd have no idea what's running through your head, and then you go away and then take that, like, I know that's not my responsibility that you go away and take it like that, but that has like such an impact.
Absolutely, such an impact. And when you think about things like police forces, for instance, who don't know anything about trauma, sometimes they're learning now.
Yeah.
And it's that term trauma informed means they have an understanding of people's trauma responses.
Yeah.
So that they give people what they need in that moment. And of course they would do after something like an accident, so somebody would be wrapped in something
when it's a visual.
Yeah, when it's a physical trauma, But the emotional trauma is what they struggle with.
And that's almost the thing that's like needed more of that.
I should say they can struggle with, because it's getting much better.
Okay. So with adults now and like the normal pressures of society, if they've got childhood trauma, then the pressures of like day-to-day life, and they can't see like a way out, and then that anxiety and that depression, and so they keep going around in a cycle. They think there's a way out, and then they get so far, and then they come back, and then they like have that anxiety and depression and go back, like, and that's a constant cycle. How is that cycle broken? It's just that awareness.
Awareness is key. I guess thinking about how they're going to do something differently to get out of that would be, but then that often takes the first small step. So how might I've heard that happen for people? Would that help if I said that?
Yeah.
So it could be that they've been on a counselling waiting list for years, and that comes up.
Okay.
And they make a start on addressing the symptoms that they experience, or they look at something like counselling gives you a whole hour normally a week to bring a lot of attention to your situation. So it normally allows people to see things slightly differently and see ways of getting out or changing things. But some people are in a situation that is impossible to change for the time being. It might be that they're caring for somebody and nothing will change until that person, well, maybe they're caring for a child and that they'll always be the responsible person for that child. There could be a lifelong. So it's about what we'd suggest really is, how can somebody bring attention to what they need would be a really good one in that situation. So self-care. Self-care is a term that's a bit modern and it's a bit like used, bandied about, I suppose, but it doesn't have to be, it's generally not going and drinking, for instance. It's generally about how can I do something for myself which gives me some time to myself. So that can be, sort of anything from taking a bath when you want to, and at the heat you want it, to cooking yourself a beautiful meal, or cooking the meal that you want, or taking a walk, obviously, or anything that is about what you need. Because as soon as you can start directing inwards about what it is that I can do for myself in this moment, that's when we start to realise that we can change how we feel up here in the head. So change the way we see things.
So with that self-care, a lot of people would see self-care as going and having an evening in front of the TV with Netflix and a bar of chocolate, and giving yourself what you need. Like, what if people think they need that? Is that what they actually need, or are they just masking what they need with what they think will help?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because something like chocolate is full of sugar, and it's likely to make you feel depressed at some point, because you might get a sugar rush, but you're likely to get a come down. Which is why I said that drinking's not great, because of the same reasons. You know, that it can feel fun in the moment, but the following day you're likely to feel worse. And so then later in the week you might get anxiety, or depression from that event, depending on how much someone drinks. So it's if somebody got something out of watching Netflix in the way of, that's the first time I've ever really given that time to myself, and that's the start of a process, then it's valid. If that's their only form of self-care, less valid.
Yeah.
You know, if self-care can also be around how to look after self, then that's going to be a far more positive experience in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be, you know, like, so whether it's bringing attention to wanting to be more fit, or wanting to eat better, or wanting to learn to meditate, because something like meditation is one of those hard things to approach unless you really feel the need for it, because it seems so lame. Like, how could something where you just sit quietly give you anything positive, really? But there's layers of benefit to meditation, and it doesn't have to be done in quiet either, because you can have a guided meditation.
Yeah.
So, and you can do it for a very short period of time, and what that starts to do is reframe our thinking. So over time, we can feel differently about the same thing, so the same situation we're in. There's a saying here which is something like, you know, the only thing we can control is how we react to something, how we respond to something, and that's what something like meditation can help, is how we respond to certain situations that are difficult.
Yeah. Would you say, for somebody that's just understanding that they might have some sense of trauma, self-care would be one of the first steps going into, like, actualizing, okay, I need some support and help with this? So the first step would to be, well, I guess it's again that individual journey, because you could go down self-care, okay, I need support, so I need to go see somebody, and everybody would go on a different journey with that. So they might go see somebody first to get the validation that they need, that, okay, actually I'm allowed to give myself this self-care. So everybody would be on a different journey, I guess. So the support would be self-care.
So I've got a little example of this, I suppose. I've just came to mind, and it's about the meditation, but it's not in a traditional sense. So somebody that I have been working with had experienced a lot of trauma early on in his life and later in his life, because it all sort of leads to the same type of thing: abuse in childhood, abuse in adulthood. Well, he does his own form of meditation, and he uses it to process his severe depressive thoughts, and he's only just got to that point where he can do that. And it's taken him many years. So this is what we talk about, a journey.
Yeah.
You know, for some people it might be the first thing they do is pick up something that they, you know, something around meditation or yoga or something like that, because that's such a traditional form of, I want to help myself, oh, I'll join a class, I'll do something that other people do. Well, this is how different everybody's journey is going to be.
Yeah.
And then other people might you know, as this person had received counselling, has been through different forms of support from services, for instance, because that's what's available to him, and then he's now got to this stage where he uses the meditation as a tool, and it's something that takes him quite a lot of time. So it's not like a 10-minute meditation, it's more like an hour or two meditation.
Okay. And
that's how he processes his difficult feelings.
Okay.
Really beneficial to him to have that tool. Everybody's journey is going to be very individually. I'm trying to think of other journeys that I can think of. It's like the other thing about meditation is that people come to that, often the ones that have used it so the most are people that have been in the most extreme situation.
Okay.
So facing really difficult stuff.
So it's almost like yin yang, isn't it? Like, so this is that severe that I need that relaxation to, like, bring the two together, so I'm here.
Well, for instance, it's like people who struggle with insomnia. I offer these polyvagal exercises, so that's a whole nother topic, but polyvagal is a way of understanding trauma responses as well, and how to regulate our nervous system. So the polyvagal is linked to our information is all linked to our nervous system. And the polyvagal exercises are absolutely brilliant for helping people sleep. Well, it's going to be, you know, a lot of people will not look at that, will not feel that maybe is their thing. But those that are struggling with insomnia in such a serious way that they have to do something, will use that, will actually use that information that I send them, and then report back that it's really helped. So, but it's like also like those the film that I watched recently, which talked about how people have been through very extreme things, and when they meet that very low point, something comes to help them come back up the other side. And for that lady that I'm thinking of, it was the gratitude practice. So how can I be grateful for what I've got in this very, very difficult situation that I'm in?
Okay. When you said about the nervous system, then, like, trauma, is it all trauma? Does all trauma come back to the nervous system? Does it all like
register on the nervous system?
Is it all stored there almost, or like? Well,
that's the theory that from Bessel van der Kolk, which is the original person who put together him and Babette Rothschild. This is what from memory, so it might not be absolutely. There might have been somebody before them too, but that's what I've learned. He understood that trauma gets stored in the body. And he talks about his book, which is The Body Keeps the Score, how we can do things to release the trauma that are physical, so that's like yoga or even lifting weights or karate, something more physical. And I've known somebody that could release their trauma through singing high notes. So they would get into a state, like in a way of releasing. So is it always connected to the nervous system? Well, I think if you're experiencing trauma responses, yes, because anxiety is felt through the nervous system.
So is depression. So is that's an interesting way to look at it, because visually you can like see it going round. And then it makes sense that exercise, movement, feeding yourself the right things, it all links into like it's almost like an energy transfer, isn't it? So that negative energy in needs a positive energy
to rebalance it.
That's and what like so like people that struggle, well, I think it comes down to like that self-love, isn't it? It's giving, because to do those things you have to love yourself to do those things. And the people that struggle, they kind of know they want to do them, but then they're not doing them. So how do they do them? Like if they're there, like what would be the step for them to take?
And what I'm hearing there is that what often comes along with that is the harsh inner critic. So there's a voice inside saying you don't deserve this, or you do deserve it. If something bad's happened, you deserve that, rather than you deserve something good. So there's probably some work there that needs to be done about, the harsh inner critic. How can that be softened? Where does that come from? Why do you have that harsh inner critic? That needs to change to allow the self-care to happen and the self-love to happen. And it doesn't have to be from self-hate to self-love either. There can be a process of transition in that. So
it almost has to be a process, doesn't it? Because it's two extremes now, isn't it?
To expect that is a big step, isn't it? But to reduce the self-hate thoughts by understanding where they've come from, I found that really powerful with people that I've worked with. That it's kind of been a bit of a shock or a light bulb moment when they realise why they have that harsh inner critic. And then the challenge might be around doing something for yourself that is loving, even though you have that harsh inner critic. So it's a little bit like saying, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm going to challenge myself in that way. Just like people who experience a lot of guilt. The challenge is that to keep reminding yourself it's not your guilt, for instance. So, sometimes with counselling, what we do is we get to a point where we say, well, this, one of the techniques is to challenge it. So I'm feeling this, but I'm not just going to accept that I'm feeling it. I'm going to challenge it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say, well, actually, that's not my guilt.
Yeah.
Or actually, that's not my real voice in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
That's whoever's voice, who I now no longer have to listen to or please. And then slowly, by putting in those, even if it's going through the motions, like, you know, if self-love is very difficult, then it's really small steps. You know, what could it be? Maybe it is Netflix and chocolate for a little while.
Yeah.
Until
you've given yourself enough of that to move to the next step.
Exactly. You can even you can say, I'm going to do the easiest form of self-love for this length of time, and then I'm going to try and challenge it and give myself a little bit of something that would be maybe better for me and more healthy for me.
Like a walk, or okay. So that the inner critic would that be linked to limiting beliefs?
Yeah.
So that would be like beliefs that have been installed from a young age, that's the way and that's the only way.
Yeah.
But when you get older and you realise, oh, actually, is that the only way? It's almost like opening up a whole new world, isn't it?
The thing with limiting beliefs, they don't necessarily have to have come from something that would
negative.
also be abusive.
Yeah.
Because it can just be from being poor.
Yeah.
And never experiencing what it's like to not be poor.
Yeah.
So that becomes the norm. And then you end up thinking, well, the mind can't even go to what it would be like to anything different.
Because it's never experienced it.
Yeah, never experienced it. Or it could be a sort of an early introject from a grandparent, say, who said something that's very absolute for them. Yeah. You know, even if it was tomatoes are bad for you, or potatoes are bad for you, or something.
Yeah, and then you go on believing
and then that's your belief for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily associated to the harsh inner critic. The harsh inner critic tends to come from a severe parent.
Okay. And
so if that person is still in your mind, they're still running you. You know, they're still guiding you and running you, and that's the bit you want to take back.
Okay.
And actually know I'm a different individual and I want something different for myself.
Yeah. So limiting beliefs is not, it is a little bit
it can be connected
with that, but there is a whole other area to go into. Cool.
Yeah, definitely they can be connected, because if you've experienced a harsh or severe parent, and then that parent's also said you will be no good at, you will get nowhere, then that's going to be your mindset.
Okay, cool.
More than likely, maybe not. You know, you could just do the opposite and go, "I'm going to prove you wrong."
Yeah, it depends again on that personality.
It's going to depend on the personality.
Yeah. There's so much that goes into it, and that's, I think, why everybody needs to go on their journey, isn't it?
Like, it's such a personal thing.
It is. It really is. It's like taking information from as many sources as you want, relate to what is relatable to you, and then take the next step that you need to take for you.
That's right. It's got to be the personal journey.
Yeah.
What works for one person won't work for another. Won't necessarily.
Yeah.
It might.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a self-care wheel that I've got on a printed sheet, for instance, has so many different forms of self-care that you would never have even thought of. That's a good example for that, because that just shows how it's not just this. There's not only 5 things to do. There's like endless. Almost endless things. Endless.
Yeah.